Ruby stared at the glowing blue core, her fingers locked around its jagged frame. The device did not just pulse. It hammered against her palm with a rhythmic, heavy thud that matched her own frantic heartbeat. Each beat sent a ripple of static through the air, making the fine hairs on her arms stand rigid. Her hands trembled, not from fatigue, but from the raw, unrefined power leaking through the casing. She braced her feet against the uneven cavern floor, trying to find a balance that did not exist in this place. Suddenly, the ground beneath her heels groaned. A hairline fracture spiderwebbed across the stone, glowing with a sickly pale luminescence that mirrored the battery. She shifted her weight, slamming her shoulder into the cold wall to steady herself as the vibration intensified. The cavern wall shuddered, shedding dust and loose pebbles. She did not look away. She kept her focus fixed on the core, drawing the energy inward, forcing it to sync with her own pulse. The light flickered, turned blindingly bright, and then settled into a steady, dangerous hum. She had the power, but the realm was already fighting back. Darius stood a few paces away, his attention split between the cavern entrance and the object in his grip. He clutched a single, wilted petal of a life flower, its edges curling inward as if recoiling from the cave's stagnant air. His knuckles were white, his gaze darting repeatedly toward the deep, hungry shadows pooling along the far wall. Something moved in the dark. It was a rhythmic, calculated sound, the soft rasp of metal against stone. He did not blink. He tightened his hold on the petal, sensing the faint, dying warmth radiating from its veins. The beast hunters were there, waiting for the light to falter. He watched the shadows coalesce into shapes, tall and jagged, pressing closer against the perimeter of the cavern. He caught Ruby's eye and jerked his chin toward the blackness, a silent warning that the perimeter was failing. A pebble skittered across the floor, kicked by a boot from within the gloom. Darius stopped breathing, his muscles coiled tight, ready to spring. The silence of the cave was no longer empty. It was heavy with the presence of those who hunted them. He knew if the petal failed, the shadows would claim them both. The cavern ceiling did not hold. As the stone groaned, it fractured, peeling back to reveal a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Violet light bled through the fissures, casting long, sickly shadows across the floor. The horizon was not fixed. It pulsed with a rhythmic, sickening intensity that made the eyes ache. Outside, the world was a nightmare of shifting geometry. Darius stumbled as the ground beneath his boots tilted, the flat surface of the cave floor sliding like a deck of cards. He threw his arm out to catch the wall, his fingers scraping against jagged rock. Gravity seemed to fluctuate, pulling them toward the opening where the violet sky churned. Ruby watched the horizon ripple, mountains in the distance folding into themselves before sprouting upward again. They were not just miles from home. They were anchored to a reality that refused to remain still. Every step they took was a gamble against a landscape that rewrote its own borders every few seconds. The isolation was absolute. There was no path to follow because the path itself was constantly being erased and rebuilt. They stood in the center of the chaos, small and exposed, while the very earth beneath them sought to shake them off its surface. The ground beneath them gave a final, shuddering lurch, throwing dust into the air. Ruby gripped the battery, its blue glow flickering in sync with the pulse of the violet sky above. The silence that followed the tremor was short-lived. A sharp snapping of branches echoed from the direction of the dense, twisted thicket. Both Ruby and Darius spun toward the sound, hands moving instinctively to their defense. A figure emerged from the shadows, stumbling into the small clearing with a gait that defied rhythm. It was Jacqueline. She moved with a strange, twitching intensity, her limbs jerking as if directed by unseen wires. She did not call out. She did not acknowledge the danger of the hunters. She stepped over a fissure in the rock, her balance seemingly non-existent, yet she advanced with a terrifying, singular purpose. Her eyes were fixed on Ruby, wide and unblinking. She stopped mid-clearing, her body trembling with the same erratic cadence that governed the shifting landscape. Ruby took a half step back, the battery pulsing brighter in her palm. The relief of seeing a familiar face vanished in an instant, replaced by the cold realization that the person standing before them was not the one they knew. Jacqueline stood rigid, her breath hitching in a jagged, unnatural pattern, waiting for the space between them to close. Jacqueline tilted her head at an impossible angle. The movement was fluid, lacking the hesitation that defined her usual presence. She cleared her throat, a dry, grating sound that seemed to vibrate against the cavern walls. When she spoke, the voice that emerged was not her own. It was deep, layered with a gravelly, oppressive authority that belonged to someone far more dangerous. "The exchange is complete," she rasped. The words hit the air with the weight of a physical blow. Ruby froze, the battery in her palm dimming momentarily, as if reacting to the intrusion. Darius stepped forward, his mouth opening to call her name, but he stopped, his jaw locking tight. The cadence was unmistakably that of Stell, the leader they had spent weeks fleeing. This was not a mimicry, it was a total occupation of her physical form. The cavern seemed to grow colder as the realization settled over them. Jacqueline stood perfectly still now, her erratic twitching replaced by a predatory calm. She stared through them, her eyes reflecting the violet light of the sky, showing no recognition of the friends she had once fought beside. Ruby looked from the empty gaze of her comrade to the hand that had held the life flower, finally understanding that their path back home had just been sabotaged from within. Stell and Jacqueline did not wait for a response. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, the gravel crunching under her feet with a sound that echoed too loudly in the confined space. Her fingers twitched, flexing in a slow, rhythmic motion as she reached out toward the pulsing blue light in Ruby's palm. There was no warmth in the gesture, only a clinical, detached hunger. "The exchange is complete," she repeated, the voice rasping against the stillness of the cavern like metal on stone. She was not asking for the battery, she was asserting ownership. Ruby felt the device hum against her skin, the vibration growing erratic and sharp. The air between them grew heavy, charged with a static pressure that made the hair on Ruby's arms stand rigid. Every instinct screamed that this was a violation of everything they had worked to preserve. Darius remained rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the hand reaching toward Ruby, his muscles coiled to spring but held back by the sheer impossibility of the situation. Stell and Jacqueline ignored him entirely, her focus narrowing to the glowing core. She closed the distance, her palm extended, palm up, waiting for the item to be surrendered. The cavern walls seemed to press inward, suffocating the light, as the moment of inevitable betrayal arrived. Ruby did not surrender the battery. Instead, she took a sharp, jagged breath, her vision tunneling until only the hand reaching toward her remained. She did not strike out at the body she knew. She turned her focus to the space between them. With a sudden, guttural cry of frustration, she swung her arm in a wide arc and slammed her fist against the jagged limestone of the cave wall. The impact was not merely physical. The air, already thick with magical static, rippled like water under a heavy stone. A shockwave of condensed force erupted from the point of contact, tearing through the cavern's atmosphere. It hit the intruder with the weight of a physical wall. Stell and Jacqueline was lifted off her feet, her composure breaking as she was shoved violently backward toward the cavern entrance. She skidded across the uneven ground, her heels carving deep grooves into the dust before she finally collapsed, breathless and disoriented. The silence that followed the blast was absolute. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the faint violet light. Ruby stood with her hand still pressed against the stone, her chest heaving, the blue light of the battery pulsing in rhythm with her own racing heart. The intruder scrambled to regain balance, but the distance had been reset. The immediate threat was held at bay, but the cavern remained a trap. Stell and Jacqueline rose, but the movement was wrong. The grace was gone, replaced by a stiff, mechanical precision that jarred against the form she occupied. She tilted her head, and the gesture was too sharp, too deliberate. Ruby watched, her breath hitching, as the intruder smoothed her palms over the unfamiliar limbs. The realization hit like a physical blow. This was not just an infiltration, it was a displacement. Ruby looked down at her own hands, flexing her fingers. They responded, a heartbeat, too late. A sluggish delay that sent a jolt of nausea through her. She glanced at Darius, He was staring at his own reflection in a pool of standing water, his brow furrowed in confusion as he touched his face. The dissonance was absolute. They were trapped in a realm where even their own skin had become a stranger. The magic of this place had not just fractured the world, it had dismantled their very selves mid-flight. Every twitch of a muscle, every blink of an eye, felt like operating a machine from a distance. The intruder laughed, a sound that emerged from the wrong throat, deepening the dread. They were not fighting a single enemy. They were fighting the loss of their own existence. Darius watched the intruder, then looked down at the withered petal in his palm. The life flower was gray, its edges curling into brittle dust, yet a faint, rhythmic heat pulsed from its center. He knew the cost of using it here, in a realm where magic tore at reality like a serrated blade. The cavern floor groaned, a low, tectonic rumble that vibrated through his heels. Stones shifted, falling from the vaulted ceiling to shatter against the floor. There was no time left to weigh the risks. He caught Ruby's gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, and he saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes. Darius shifted his weight, digging his boots into the shifting silt. He did not hesitate. He lunged forward, his movements fueled by the desperate need to reclaim their own existence. He swung his arm wide, launching the petal into the air toward the center of the chamber. As it left his fingertips, he followed through, his body tensing for the inevitable backlash of the raw energy about to be unleashed. The air around the petal began to warp, swirling into a miniature vortex of light that defied the gloom of the cavern. The petal disintegrated before it reached the peak of its arc. It did not simply burn, it unraveled, shedding sparks of pure, white-hot intensity that hung suspended in the air. For a heartbeat, the entire cavern held its breath. Then, the light expanded. It struck the stone walls with the force of a physical blow, turning the jagged rock into translucent glass before vaporizing the edges entirely. Ruby shielded her eyes, but the brilliance bypassed her lids, searing into her vision until every shadow vanished. The sound followed not a boom, but a high-pitched, crystalline shriek that vibrated against her teeth. Gravity seemed to warp, pulling her weightless for a fraction of a second as the floor beneath her disintegrated into dust. There was no direction, no up or down, only the relentless expansion of the white glow. Every detail of the cavern, the damp smell of the silt, the sharp edges of the pillars, the cold bite of the mountain air was scrubbed away in a single, silent instant. The light folded inward, consuming the space, the hunters, and the very air, until there was nothing left but the blinding, absolute void. The white light shattered, replaced by the crushing weight of gravity. Ruby hit hard, her shoulder slamming into jagged stone. She gasped, the air thin and tasting of oxidized iron. She was not in the cavern anymore. She pushed herself up, her palms scraping against cold, flaked metal. Around her, the ruins of the iron spire stretched into a gray, overcast sky. Massive, twisted girders lay like the bones of some fallen leviathan, half buried in ash and pulverized concrete. A few yards away, Darius was already on his feet, his balance unsteady as he stumbled over a pile of rubble. His eyes scanned the horizon, his breathing ragged. Jacqueline lay nearby, face down in the grit, her fingers twitching against the jagged floor. The silence here was different, hollow, echoing with the distant groan of settling metal. Ruby stood, her legs trembling, and looked up at the skeletal towers that clawed at the clouds. Everything felt wrong. The scale of the architecture, the dull, muted colors, the way the wind whistled through the hollowed-out windows of the towers. It was a graveyard of industry, standing silent under a bruised sky. They were here, but the world felt alien, cold, and entirely indifferent to their arrival. Ruby reached out to steady Darius, but her hand stopped midair. She looked at her own fingers, then back at Darius, and a cold clarity settled in her gut. She tried to ask what had happened, but the sound that left her throat was low, gravelly, and entirely foreign. She froze. The rhythm of her own thoughts felt like a language she no longer knew how to speak. Beside her, Darius stumbled, his eyes wide and unfocused. He gripped his head with both hands, his knuckles white, as if trying to hold his own mind together by force. He opened his mouth to shout, but the voice that emerged was sharp, high-pitched, and frantic, the voice of Jacqueline. The disorientation was not just the landscape, it was the skin they occupied. They were strangers in their own bodies. Ruby stepped back, her boot catching on a piece of rusted debris, but the reflexes she relied on were gone. She landed hard, her movements heavy and uncoordinated. Every gesture felt delayed, filtered through a nervous system that did not belong to her. She looked at the others, her gaze frantic, searching for a spark of recognition, but as their eyes met, there was only the hollow terror of looking into a mirror and seeing someone else looking back. Jacqueline pushed herself up from the ash, the motion jerky and unpracticed. She stood, but her center of gravity was wrong. She swayed, her arms hanging heavy at her sides. She took a breath, and the sound was a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floor beneath her feet. She looked at her hands, flexing fingers that felt thick and calloused, then looked up at Ruby. She opened her mouth to speak, but the sound that emerged was not her own. It was dark, layered, and heavy, sounding like stones grinding together in a deep well. She winced at the dissonance of her own words. She tried again, forcing the muscles of her throat to adapt to the new, strange architecture. She reached out, her movements broad and sweeping, and pointed a steadying finger toward the jagged line of the horizon. The action was deliberate, yet the voice remained an alien intrusion, haunting and wrong. She stood there, a stranger in a familiar frame, waiting for the others to process the sound of her new existence. The air around them grew still, the weight of her deep, resonant command hanging in the silence like a physical barrier they were now forced to cross. They followed the direction of the pointing finger, moving with the awkward gait of bodies they had not yet learned to command. As they crested the jagged ridge, the landscape opened up into a desolate plain. There, silhouetted against the violet light of the sky, the true scale of their situation became clear. A line of figures stood near the ruins of a collapsed archway. In the center stood Jules, her presence absolute. She was not alone. Flanking her on both sides was a wall of hunters, their presence forming a blockade that stretched across the entire pass. The metallic glint of their gear caught the dim light, casting long, harsh shadows across the dust. Ruby squinted, her breath hitching as she counted the rows. There were dozens of them, standing in perfect, silent formation, waiting for a signal that had not yet been given. The ground beneath the hunters remained still, while the earth near the group continued to ripple and shift. They were trapped between a landscape that refused to hold solid and an army that refused to move. The distance between them was closing, and the sheer number of hunters turned the air cold. There was no room for error, no place to hide, and no time to recover their senses. They watched, paralyzed, as Jules turned her head to scan the ridge, her eyes locking onto their position with terrifying precision. The moment Jules turned, the formation broke. It was not a chaotic rush, but a synchronized, mechanical surge. The line of hunters fanned out, their movements fluid and predatory. Ruby scrambled backward, the loose shale beneath her feet sliding into the ravine with a sharp, echoing clatter. That sound was a beacon. From the center of the enemy line, a single scout detached, moving with unnerving speed toward their position. The group ducked behind a jagged outcropping, hearts hammering against ribs that felt foreign and fragile. They pressed themselves into the cold rock, listening to the rhythmic thud of boots closing the distance. There were more hunters than they had initially perceived, emerging from the surrounding brush like shadows detaching from the earth. Every path forward was being systematically cut off. The metallic clink of weapons echoed through the canyon, bouncing off the walls until the sound seemed to come from every direction at once. They were no longer just observers, they were the quarry. Ruby gripped the battery, feeling its pulse synchronize with the rising panic in the air. The army was closing in, and the space between them and the hunters was shrinking with every passing second of their paralysis. There was nowhere left to run that wasn't already occupied by a blade. Jacqueline pressed her back against the granite, her chest heaving as she spoke in the deep, gravelly tone of Darius. "She is not just hunting us, she whispered, the voice trembling with a sudden sharp clarity. She is tracking the resonance. The battery is a lighthouse in this darkness. Ruby looked down at the blue core. The light within it seemed to intensify, pulsing in rhythm with the approaching thuds of the hunter's boots. Every flicker of that glow was a signal flare broadcasting their location across the canyon. The realization hit them with the weight of a physical blow. Their only hope for escape was the very thing that made them impossible to hide. Jacqueline reached out, her fingers hovering near the device, but she pulled back, as if burned. Jules knows what it does. She knows it can rewrite the path home. That is why the entire army is here. The hunters were not searching blindly anymore. They were homing in on the energy signature. The space behind the outcropping felt smaller, the air thick with the hum of the device. They were trapped by their own equipment. Every second they held onto the battery, the net tightened. They had to move, but they had to do it while carrying a beacon that screamed their presence to every hunter in the valley. There was no more time for strategy. Ruby reached out, her fingers closing around the pulsating core. The reaction was instantaneous. A searing heat surged up her arm, white hot and stinging, as if the battery were drinking the vitality directly from her veins. She gasped, her knees buckling under the sudden, draining weight of the energy transfer. It was not just light, it was a hungry force, pulling at her strength with every throb of its blue glow. Her skin turned a pale, sickly translucent, and she could feel the cold numbness spreading from her palm toward her heart. She grit her teeth, forcing her hand to lock firmly onto the device, despite the tremors racking her frame. "We run now," she commanded, though her voice lacked its usual steadiness. Behind them, the sound of rhythmic boots grew louder, a mechanical cadence that promised no mercy. She pushed herself upright, fighting the vertigo that threatened to drop her back into the dirt. The battery hummed, a low, vibrating drone that rattled her very bones. She didn't look back. She forced her leaden legs to move, dragging the group into the gloom as the energy continued to siphon her life, leaving her gasping for air with every heavy, desperate stride. They sprinted past the last rock face and crossed into the whispering forest. The transition was immediate and unsettling. The ambient light of the canyon died, replaced by a suffocating, emerald gloom. Here, the trees did not merely grow, they leaned. Massive, knotted trunks tilted inward, their branches interlocking like skeletal fingers woven to block out the sky. Every time the wind stirred, the leaves produced a dry, rasping sound that mimicked human whispers. Ruby stumbled, her boots catching on a thick, pulsing root that seemed to have shifted into her path only seconds before. She regained her balance, but the forest felt tighter than it had moments ago. The space between the trees narrowed, forcing them to move in single file. Darius looked back, his expression tight, but the trail they had just carved was already gone, obscured by thick, shifting vines that writhed in the shadows. The forest was not merely a landscape, it was an observer. The very air felt dense, heavy with the sensation of thousands of eyes tracking their movement through the undergrowth. They were no longer just running from soldiers. They were being funneled deeper into a labyrinth that breathed and watched. Every turn brought them into a tighter corridor of bark and leaf, isolating them further from any hope of a clean exit. The forest floor vibrated under their boots, but the sound of pursuit had transformed. The rhythmic stomp of boots was replaced by the soft, rhythmic rustling of weight shifting in the canopy directly above. Ruby felt the shift in the air before she heard it, a sharp, piercing whistle that cut through the canopy. She lunged forward, shoving Darius toward a cluster of thick ferns just as a heavy, weighted mesh slammed into the dirt where they had been standing a heartbeat earlier. The impact sent a spray of soil and rotting leaves into her eyes. She did not stop to wipe it away. Another net hissed through the air, clipping the edge of a branch and snapping the wood with a crack like a gunshot. The hunters were no longer tracking them. They were raining death from the shadows. Every time Ruby tried to find a clear path, another net flared out from the darkness, forcing them to veer sharply off course. The ground became a treacherous tangle of slick mud and exposed roots, making every panicked step a gamble against gravity. She could hear the distinct metallic click of triggers being pulled above them. There was no time to look up, no time to plan, and no cover left to find. They were running through a gauntlet, and the sky was closing in on them with every passing second. Every stride was an agony of miscalculation. Ruby felt her legs move with a rhythm that was not her own, the muscles firing with strange, unfamiliar tension that betrayed her intent. She reached out to vault over a fallen log, but her arm misjudged the distance, slapping against the bark instead of clearing it. She stumbled, her center of gravity lurching wildly as she fought to compensate. Beside her, Darius was worse. He moved with a heavy, lumbering gait, his feet catching on the uneven forest floor with every third step. His lungs labored, the air rasping in a throat that felt too wide, too thick. They were trying to outrun death in vessels that did not know how to run for them. The forest blurred into a streak of gray and green, but the physical dissonance was louder than the hunt. Ruby squeezed her hands into fists, forcing her consciousness to lock onto the foreign nerves. She drove her heels into the soft earth, pushing past the burning fatigue of muscles that were not hers. They could not afford a single error, yet their own bodies fought against their commands. She grabbed Darius by the shoulder, dragging him forward as he faltered. They moved as one broken entity, a desperate, clattering force lunging toward the edge of the woods. A shadow detached from the canopy, dropping silently behind them. Ruby heard the scrape of leather against bark and threw herself sideways, barely registering the hunter as he plummeted into the spot she had just occupied. The impact sent him sprawling, but he was already reaching for a weighted net coiled at his side. Ruby didn't slow. She shoved Darius into a narrow gap between two ancient, gnarled trunks. A sharp, rhythmic whistling sound cut through the air, the signature of a weighted trap being swung with lethal force. It passed inches from her ear, the vibration of the cords humming against her skin. She ducked, feeling the wind of the net as it slammed into the trunk behind her, the heavy mesh vibrating with the kinetic energy of the throw. The sound of the trap hit the wood like a thunderclap, a violent reminder that death was mere inches away. She scrambled over a slick root, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Another net hissed through the branches above, tearing through the leaves in a spray of splintered wood and debris. They were running through a gauntlet of steel and cord. She grabbed Darius, pulling him through a dense thicket of thorns. The whistling of the traps grew louder, more frequent, as they pushed toward the clearing edge. The forest ended abruptly, dropping away into a vast, silent expanse of gray mist. Before them, the void bridge stretched out a jagged, impossible span of floating stone slabs held together by flickering, translucent filaments of energy. It looked less like a path and more like a tear in the fabric of the world. Ruby skidded to a halt at the precipice, her boots spraying loose gravel into the abyss below. There was no sound down there, only a swirling, hungry emptiness that made her vision swim. Darius stumbled up beside her, his breath coming in shallow, frantic hitches as he stared at the structure. The bridge groaned, a low, tectonic vibration that traveled up through the soles of their feet, rattling their very teeth. One of the stone slabs drifted downward, tilting precariously before snapping back into place with a sickening, metallic screech. It was the only way home, yet it seemed designed to crumble the moment it was touched. Ruby reached out, her fingers hovering inches from the cold, vibrating stone. The air around the bridge tasted like ozone and static, prickling her skin. She looked back at the darkening forest, then ahead at the terrifying, fractured road. There was no turning back now. The bridge shivered, a sharp crack echoing through the void like a breaking bone. Ruby pulled her hand back, but the movement was too late. A rhythmic, metallic clanking sounded from the shifting stone behind them, growing louder with every heartbeat. She spun around, dragging Darius into a defensive crouch. Jules stepped onto the platform, her presence cutting through the ambient static of the void. She did not run, she paced, her boots striking the floating stone with a heavy, deliberate finality. A blade appeared in her hand, the metal edge catching the sickly, violet glow of the sky. She held it high, the point aimed directly at Ruby's chest. The air around Jules seemed to harden, turning thick and freezing, forcing the oxygen from the immediate area. She stopped 20 paces away, blocking the narrow path to the bridge's center. Her eyes swept over them, devoid of hesitation or doubt. The bridge groaned again, its filaments pulsing a frantic, jagged red. Yet Jules remained unmoved, a statue of cold authority amidst the collapsing reality. She took one more step forward, closing the distance, and the blade leveled out, turning the bridge into a cage. Jules did not shout to be heard over the wind. She spoke with a quiet, biting precision that carried through the static. "Identity is a luxury," she said, her voice echoing against the void. She circled them slowly, her blade tracing a wide, threatening arc in the air. "You cling to names and histories that no longer exist in this realm. I am the law of this land, and your history ends here." Every word landed with the force of a physical blow. Ruby felt the marrow in her bones ache. To Jules, they were not individuals. They were variables to be deleted. The bridge shuddered under the sheer weight of that assertion, the stone slabs grinding together as if the world itself were agreeing with her decree. Jules stopped, her stance wide and immovable, her blade pointed at their hearts. She projected an absolute certainty that made the very air seem to thin and turn brittle. She was the anchor, and they were merely debris drifting toward the edge. Ruby looked at Darius, seeing her own fear mirrored in his eyes, but Jules only sneered. She took another step, her presence expanding until she seemed to fill the entire span of the bridge, leaving them no space to breathe, no room to exist, and nowhere left to run. Ruby did not answer. She did not even blink. Words were just vibrations in a dying world, and she had no more energy to waste on them. She felt the battery pulsing against her palm, the heat searing her skin, a frantic rhythm that matched her own racing heart. While Jules was still savoring the silence of her own ultimatum, Ruby shifted her weight. She pivoted on her heel, her movement sharp and sudden, turning her back on the blade. Jules let out a sharp, surprised sound, but it was too late. Ruby lunged. She sprinted across the remaining gap, her boots slamming into the fractured stone. Every step sent tremors through the bridge, but she did not break stride. She reached the center pedestal, a jagged spire of obsidian rising from the bridge deck. It was hollow, waiting. Without a second of hesitation, she rammed the glowing battery into the slot. The connection was violent. A surge of raw, white energy shot up her arm, snapping her head back. She gripped the edge of the stone with her free hand, holding on as the pedestal began to hum with a sound that threatened to shatter her teeth. The defiance was complete. The bridge began to wake. The bridge did not just hum, it screamed. As the battery locked into place, the obsidian pedestal turned white-hot, light spilling out through every seam and fissure in the foundation. The stone beneath Ruby's feet groaned, a deep, tectonic sound that vibrated through her marrow. She held her ground, fingers locked onto the pedestal, as the bridge began to twist. Massive cracks spider-webbed outward from the core, jagged lines of darkness cutting through the stone deck. Dust and debris rained upward, caught in the sudden reversal of gravity. The structure tilted violently, sending a shower of boulders cascading into the void below. Each crack widened, spitting out sparks of blue energy that scorched the air. Ruby felt the bridge buckle under her knees, the stone turning brittle and porous like dry bone. It was coming apart, shedding its own history with every shuddering impact. The sound grew deafening, a chorus of grinding rock and tearing dimensions that drowned out everything else. The path forward was gone, replaced by a yawning chasm of light, and the bridge beneath them was no longer a road, but a trap waiting to snap shut. Every support beam groaned in protest, snapping under the weight of the impossible power now coursing through the span. The final threshold passed. The pedestal exploded outward, not with fire, but with a concussive wall of pure, kinetic force. Ruby curled her body into a ball, shielding her face as the air itself turned into a physical barrier. The shockwave hit with the weight of a falling mountain. It tore through the bridge deck, lifting massive slabs of stone and sending them spiraling into the abyss. Jules, standing at the edge of the span, had no time to brace. The blast caught her square in the chest, lifting her off her feet and hurling her backward into the swirling chaos of the void. She vanished into the light, her scream swallowed by the roar of the collapsing reality. The bridge vanished behind her, atomized by the surge. Below, the ground turned to mist, and the sky above buckled, folding in on itself like burning paper. Every direction became a blur of white and violet light. There was no floor, no horizon, only the relentless expansion of the energy pulse. The structures of the realm shattered into dust, floating in the void. Everything that had held the false world together was being erased, piece by jagged piece, leaving only the sound of a universe unraveling at the seams. The sky ceased to exist, replaced by a churning vortex of white static. Ruby reached out, her fingers clawing at the empty air as the ground beneath her vanished entirely. There was no up, no down, only the sensation of falling through a hollow space. She spun, limbs flailing, until a hand caught her wrist with bone-crushing intensity. It was Jacqueline. She pulled Ruby toward her, their shoulders colliding in the void. They drifted, weightless, while the remnants of the forest and the spires disintegrated into glowing dust around them. Ruby felt the frantic tremor in Jacqueline's grip, a raw, physical pulse that matched her own. She squeezed back, locking their fingers together until her knuckles turned pale. This connection was the only solid thing left in a universe that had abandoned all logic. They pressed their backs together, bracing against the gale-force winds of the collapsing dimension. The chaos raged, tearing at the edges of their perception, but the pressure of their joined hands held them anchored to one another. They were two anchors in a sea of unraveling light, refusing to let the void pull them apart. Every shift in the surrounding pressure was met with a tighter hold. They breathed in sync, ignoring the roar of the imploding reality, focused entirely on the anchor of their shared grip. The roar of the collapse softened into a high-pitched hum. Ruby stared at the hand she held, watching as the skin seemed to blur into the encroaching brilliance. It did not matter whose hand it was. The stolen forms, the shifting memories, the entire deception of the realm, it all washed away like ink in a downpour. She felt the weight of her own body thinning, turning into something lighter, something elemental. Jacqueline leaned into her, their foreheads touching. The heat radiating between them was the only truth left. They were no longer defined by the borders of their stolen shapes. The void demanded a price, but they had already paid it by discarding the need to be who they were before. The white light intensified, blinding and absolute, scouring the air until no shadows remained. Every stray thought of their past lives vanished, replaced by the singular, rhythmic thrum of their joined hearts. They were not fighting the void anymore. They were becoming part of the current. The reality that had imprisoned them was now nothing more than dust, scattered across an infinite, silent expanse of white. They held the grip, tighter than ever, letting the last remnants of their individual identities dissolve into the brightness. In this absolute purity, they were finally free of the roles they had been forced to play. There was no more space for deception, only the quiet, steady rhythm of their unity. The threshold opened before them, a jagged tear in the fabric of the light. Behind them, the world they had inhabited shrieked in its final moments. Structures crumbled into crystalline shards, and the ground surged upward, folding in on itself like paper. They did not look back. The hunters, the leaders, the entire architecture of their imprisonment were being crushed into silence by the sheer force of the collapse. The void beckoned, a vast, quiet expanse devoid of the illusions that had defined their struggle. They took a single step forward, their feet finding purchase on nothingness. The momentum of the world's destruction pushed them from behind, a wave of kinetic energy that offered no choice but to go. They locked their fingers, drew a final breath, and threw their weight into the opening. Gravity vanished. There was a sensation of falling, but this time, it was not chaotic. It was a clean, sharp descent into the unknown. They plummeted through the center of the aperture, leaving the debris of their former prison to vanish in the implosion. The white light flared once, brilliant and absolute, then snuffed out entirely. They were gone. The false reality folded into itself, leaving only empty space where the tower, the forest, and the hunters once stood. Silence followed, profound and total, as the void claimed everything that was not real.